As midnight struck on January 30th, 1968, South Vietnam erupted in chaos. The serene streets, once alive with Tet Lunar New Year festivities, were now battlegrounds. In Saigon, Viet Cong sappers breached the walls of the U.S. Embassy compound, while 84,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops unleashed an unprecedented wave of attacks across the country. Cities burned, commanders scrambled, and the world watched in shock. This was the Tet Offensive, a moment that would redefine the Vietnam War and shake the foundations of American confidence. After years of intense combat and military presence in Vietnam, U.S. officials are publicly confident about the situation. They claim that the strategy of eliminating the Viet Cong is succeeding. The North Vietnamese Communist forces are on the brink of collapse, and victory is imminent. Or so they assert. But as 1968 begins alongside the traditional Lunar New Year celebrations, U.S. and South Vietnamese troops suddenly find themselves under a powerful surprise assault by North Vietnamese forces during the Tet Offensive. By the end of 1967, the war in Vietnam has reached a stalemate. The U.S. focuses on patrols and firepower to track down and destroy the enemy, while the Viet Cong carry out guerrilla tactics in South Vietnam, often controlling where and when battles unfold. This results in heavy casualties for both sides, with no significant strategic advances, although U.S. Commander William Westmoreland presents a different view. In late 1967, he embarks on a tour across the U.S., assuring the public that his strategy is working and that the North Vietnamese are nearing defeat. While Westmoreland remains overly optimistic, there are divisions within the North Vietnamese leadership. Some leaders, later known as doves, are increasingly concerned about the heavy toll in lives and infrastructure, advocating for peace talks. These doves clash with more powerful hawks, such as Communist Party General Secretary Le Don, who push for the intensification of the war. Meanwhile, North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh is becoming politically marginalized. He has been ill since at least 1964 and has stepped down from many of his official responsibilities. North Vietnamese colonel and future dissident Bui Tin claims Ho's poor health prevents him from pushing for democratic reforms, allowing figures like Le Don and the Politburo to take more control. By 1967, the Soviet Union surpasses China as North Vietnam's main supplier of arms and heavy weapons. However, Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev favors diplomatic solutions to the conflict, which temporarily strengthens the position of the doves. In response, Le Don and his supporters arrest political rivals and journalists, often charging them with conspiracy. With his power solidified, the Hawks prepare for a major offensive designed to strike cities and towns across South Vietnam during the Tet lunar holiday. North Vietnam hopes the surprise attack on urban areas and military bases will bring down the Saigon government, destroy significant portions of the U.S. and South Vietnamese ARVN forces, and compel the U.S. to withdraw support from the South. The commanders realize the operation is risky, so they assign the bulk of the fighting to the Viet Cong, rather than the more valuable regular North Vietnamese Army, NVA. Beginning in October 1967, North Vietnamese troops begin harassing U.S. border positions, including the combat base at Khe Sanh. Westmoreland believes North Vietnam is preparing a repeat of the 1954 Dien Bien Phu offensive, but others later suggest that, instead of recreating the 1954 battle, the North Vietnamese are aiming to draw U.S. and ARVN forces away from major towns and cities. As a result, the U.S. relocates troops. Despite heavy losses on the North Vietnamese side, Westmoreland bolsters the defenses at Khe Sanh and weakens defenses around Saigon and other cities. By the end of January 1968, both North and South Vietnamese forces prepared for the lunar holiday. This is traditionally a time for ceasefire across Vietnam, but this year, Viet Cong and NVA troops infiltrate towns and cities, sometimes blending in as festival goers. Since it was common for farmers to bring their produce into cities during Tet, the presence of unknown individuals carrying goods isn't immediately suspicious, at least not to the local Vietnamese. U.S. Lieutenant Colonel John E. Barr later recalled, "I noticed an unusually high number of young men in civilian clothing, which stood out because most Vietnamese youths were either drafted by the ARVN or fighting in the hills with the Viet Cong. I was told it was customary for local farmers to come into Hue to celebrate the Tet holiday, and I accepted this explanation, which I later regretted." While U.S. military intelligence detects the movement of North Vietnamese units, they fail to grasp the full scale of the impending offensive. In reality, around 84,000 troops are poised for action across the country. At midnight on January 30th, North Vietnam initiates the first wave of coordinated attacks. Within hours, 5 out of the 6 major cities in South Vietnam, 36 out of 44 provincial capitals, and 64 district capitals are under assault. Thoen Van Bon, a lieutenant in the Northern 320th Division, attacks a U.S. Marine base near Cam Lo. Around midnight, we moved as close as we could to the American perimeter. We fired a flare, signaling the detonation of dynamite to blast holes in the perimeter. Within seconds, we sounded a bugle and blew whistles to signal our troops to advance. All 400 of us moved forward, screaming, "Attack, attack, attack." In Saigon, a group of about 20 Viet Cong sappers breaches the U.S. Embassy compound's wall and assaults the guards. Armed with automatic weapons and rocket launchers, they attempt to breach the main chancellery building but fail. U.S. diplomat Barry Sorthian contacts Colonel George Jacobson, who resides within the embassy compound. George informs him that the VC sappers have entered his house, and he can hear movement downstairs. He hears gunfire outside and sees shadowy figures moving around the compound. As far as he can tell, the embassy remains secure. Armed with a pistol, Jacobson shoots one of the sappers coming up the stairs and ultimately kills the last Viet Cong sapper, ending the attack. Other VC attempts to infiltrate the Saigon radio station and presidential palace also fail. After the initial shock, U.S. and ARVN forces quickly regroup and mount an effective defense in most areas. U.S. commanders are impressed with the ARVN, which holds its ground despite low expectations from the Americans. In the following days, U.S. and ARVN forces push back most Viet Cong and NVA advances. Although this isn't true everywhere, the ancient imperial city of Hue, known for its beautiful architecture and 19th century fortifications, becomes central to a more modern conflict. Hue had experienced little fighting up until 1968 and considered itself a true city near the border at the 17th parallel. Divided by the Perfume River into a southeastern modern city and a northwestern citadel, Hue was home to an airfield, a large university, a hospital, and government buildings. On January 30th, ARVN commander Ngo Quang Truong receives intelligence indicating a likely attack. He puts his troops on high alert, though many are on leave for Tet. However, he believes the NVA lacks the strength to assault the city. What he doesn't realize is that the NVA's 4th, 5th, and 6th regiments, supported by the Viet Cong, are converging on Hue and have already infiltrated the city with sappers and assault troops. A North Vietnamese officer will later write, "The enemy was unaware of our strategy. By the time our forces neared Hue, the enemy had not taken any specific defensive measures. Their objective is to open the city gates and swiftly capture around 200 key targets, including the Mang Ca RVN headquarters, Tay Loc Airfield, Mac V compound, landing craft loading ramp, radio station, hospital, and provincial headquarters." At 2:33 a.m. on January 31st, a flare signals the start of the attack. NVA sappers disguised in ARVN uniforms kill guards and let approximately 7,500 troops enter Hue. Immediately, ARVN soldiers within the citadel begin to mount an improvised defense, particularly the Black Panther Rangers. Intense fighting breaks out across the area, but the ARVN successfully holds the Mang Ca and contests the airfield. In the modern city, the small garrison at the Mac V compound and the nearby LCU loading ramp hold out, but by daybreak, the NVA controls around 60% of Hue. ARVN commanders urgently request reinforcements as the full scale of the attack becomes clear. some airborne troops reach Mang Ka, but ground relief columns are heavily damaged by NVA troops stationed on the citadel walls. Marines from Task Force X-Ray, including battalions from the 1st and 5th Marine Regiments, are also en route to the city. But as they near the modern city, the North Vietnamese ambush them. Enemy soldiers, concealed behind walls, buildings, and on rooftops, unleash a devastating fusillade, striking the convoy with the force of a sledgehammer crushing a cockroach. The attack comes from all directions: automatic weapons, small arms, rockets, recoilless rifles, mortars, grenades, everything all at once. The US column needs the help of M48 tanks to push through the 8 or 9 blocks to the MAC-V compound by around 3:15 p.m. Commanders quickly task the Marines with crossing the Perfume River to relieve the ARVN in the citadel, but the bridge is too weak for the tanks, and there's minimal fire support. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Gravel puts it bluntly: "We proceeded to the MAC-V compound, then were gifted with the most stupid, idiotic mission. 2 American platoons make it across, but are hit with heavy fire from the citadel walls." Realizing the attack is futile, Gravel orders a retreat, using commandeered vehicles to evacuate the wounded. About a third of a Marine company is either killed or wounded in the failed attack. It becomes clear that the ARVN and US forces are surrounded by mostly regular NVA troops determined to hold their ground, and the NVA is already planning to establish a provisional government in Hue. For the US troops, it's now a battle from the inside out. The Marines' first objectives are the modern city's provincial headquarters and prison, about 6 blocks from the compound. To reach them, they must fight through the university and hospital, but their first attempts stall less than 1 block from the compound. Meanwhile, the ARVN continues to contest the citadel and eventually retakes the airfield, allowing some resupply. The LCU loading ramp also provides a route for supplies and reinforcements via the river. Otherwise, Marine convoys, known as Rough Riders, must endure a deadly gauntlet of NVA fire as they enter the city. The fighting evolves into a street-by-street, house-by-house melee. The Marines' area of operations spans roughly 11 blocks by 8 blocks, an area not vast in size, but extremely complex to navigate. Commanders lack properly scaled maps, and rules of engagement, along with poor weather, prevent air support. Marine William Ehrheit recalls, "We had no experience at this kind of fighting, and the on-the-job training cost us heavily. A great many civilians must have died in the fighting. If you saw or heard, or thought you saw or heard, movement in the house next door, you didn't stop to knock, you just tossed in a grenade." Both sides quickly discover that rockets are invaluable, especially for blowing open walls and creating new points of entry. Lieutenant Colonel Ernie Cheatham remembers a 2-hour firefight fought almost entirely with rockets at a range of just 50 meters. Hundreds and hundreds of rockets going out, and the same thing coming back at us. But we had more ammunition than they had. Tanks, while offering some cover in the ruined streets, are limited in their effectiveness. When used offensively, they rush forward, fire a few rounds, and retreat before the inevitable barrage of North Vietnamese B-40 rockets. US troops find the 106 mm recoilless rifle particularly useful for demolitions and urban combat, especially when mounted on the M50 Onto's light anti-tank vehicle. By February 4th, the Marines are making significant progress, having captured the university and the public health building. During the attack on the Treasury, the Marines deploy tear gas, which proves effective since many NVA troops lack gas masks. Once the Treasury is cleared, the next objective is to push toward the hospital, prison, and provincial headquarters. Using a combination of tear gas, 105 mm howitzers, mortars, and recoilless rifles, the Marines drive the NVA out of the hospital and prison after intense fighting. Meanwhile, another Marine assault targets the stadium to the east of the MAC-V compound. The NVA commander, sensing the inevitable, begins thinning his forces for a potential withdrawal. The US attack now focuses on the provincial headquarters. On February 6th, Marines use their newly honed tactics to assault the building, employing tear gas in a brutal room-to-room struggle. Some defenders slip away, But by the end of the day, the Americans raised the US flag over the headquarters. However, the flag is quickly removed due to regulations requiring it to be flown alongside the South Vietnamese flag. Initially a symbolic target for the Marines, the provincial headquarters proves to be much more significant. It was the headquarters of the 4th NVA Regiment, which now begins to collapse. By February 7th, resistance in the modern city is fading, but heavy fighting continues in the citadel. The AR van had made some early progress, clearing much of the northwestern corner of the old city and areas south of the Mon Ca. But between February 6th and 7th, the NVA launches a counterattack, using grappling hooks to scale the southwestern wall and forcing the ARVN back to the airfield. Meanwhile, outside the city walls to the west, the U.S. 1st Cavalry Air Mobile Division is facing its own struggles. With the help of helicopter gunships, artillery, and reinforcements from the now helicopter-borne 101st Airborne Division, they clash with NVA forces in outlying villages, but only manage to tentatively cut the North Vietnamese's logistical routes. From February 10th, reinforcements from the 5th Marines are heli-lifted into the citadel. On February 13th, they plan to launch an attack from ARVN airborne positions to their south. But before they even arrive, they come under heavy NVA attack. In just 15 minutes, chaos erupts. Company A, without the expected airborne support, finds itself surrounded by NVA forces. The NVA, having tunneled into the citadel walls, halts the attack 75 meters behind its start line. The next morning, the Marines try again, this time with massive supporting fire, including from offshore ships. Their target is the Dong Ba Tower, one of the citadel's fortified gates. However, the flat trajectory of naval gunfire mostly harmlessly hits the exterior walls. The Marines are pinned down after just 100 meters of advance, taking heavy fire from both the palace and the outer citadel walls. On February 15th, additional U.S. reinforcements arrive, as well as permission to fire into the palace and the surrounding area. American shells partly collapse the Dong Ba Tower, and U.S. troops push through ruined walls and shattered fortifications. After a 6-hour firefight, the Marines finally capture the tower. Meanwhile, ARVN airborne forces and Marines continue to attack the palace, but their advance is slow. Once again, tear gas and heavy fire support are employed to suppress NVA defenders. By February 22nd, the fighting moves into the heart of the citadel as ARVN forces push toward the southern wall. By this point, the 1st Cavalry has succeeded in fully cutting NVA supply lines, blocking the infiltration and exfiltration of NVA fighters. The most significant development, however, is a shift in tactics. Both US and ARVN Marines launch night attacks against the remaining NVA positions, disrupting the NVA's established schedule of combat. With some NVA troops away from the front lines, many are caught by surprise and captured. Aided by improved weather and air support, the Marines and ARVN clear the palace and reach the southern wall on February 24th, raising their flags on the Huez flag tower. With only mopping up operations remaining, the battle comes to a close. The Battle of Hue cost the US around 200 killed in action, mostly Marines, and approximately 1,600 wounded. ARVN casualties are about 450 killed and missing, and 2,100 wounded. Estimating North Vietnamese casualties is challenging, but estimates suggest between 2,500 and 5,000 killed, with an unknown number wounded. The city itself suffers devastating damage, with 80% of its buildings destroyed, and of the 140,000 residents, approximately 116,000 are left homeless. Civilian deaths are believed to range from 1,000 to 5,800, either killed or missing. The Americans also accuse the NVA of conducting targeted political killings, with at least 3,000 bodies found in hastily dug graves. The North Vietnamese government counters, claiming these are civilian casualties caused by US firepower, though this claim is widely disputed. With the Battle of Hue over, one of the toughest struggles of the Tet Offensive concludes. While the NVA and VC are unable to hold their gains or trigger an uprising, the Tet Offensive is still widely regarded as a US defeat. General Westmoreland is eager to frame the offensive as the final desperate move of a nearly defeated enemy. He downplays the damage and the 3,400 US and ARVN deaths by March as superficial, asserting that North Vietnam suffers 58,000 killed. However, many disagree. The fact that North Vietnam could launch such a sophisticated offensive at all suggests that the US strategy in Vietnam is failing. Rather than being on the verge of defeat, North Vietnam delivers a shocking blow and regains the initiative. In a secret memo, General Harold K. Johnson writes, "We suffered a loss. There can be no doubt about it." The Tet Offensive also undermines the Johnson administration, which had been preparing both the public and the media for an imminent victory. Yet, the offensive reveals that the war is far from over. Photographs of the summary execution of a Viet Cong fighter by the South Vietnamese chief of police in the streets of Saigon raise further questions about the legitimacy of the regime the US is supporting. Before Tet, US public opposition to the war was growing, though it was not yet a majority. Pro-war counter-protests were common, but after Tet, opposition broadens beyond the usual anti-war, student, or counterculture groups to include mothers, middle-class professionals, religious groups, and even Vietnam veterans. By February 1968, half of Americans believe intervention was a mistake. Johnson's advisors, his so-called wise men, who had once supported escalating the war, now overwhelmingly call for disengagement and negotiations. McGeorge Bundy, one of the president's closest advisors, tells Johnson, "Look, this thing is hopeless. You'd better begin to de-escalate and get out." This marks the first time Johnson hears such blunt criticism, and he is shocked. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, the architect of US strategy in Vietnam, had privately become skeptical of the war throughout 1967, often clashing with other advisors. In November 1967, he announces his resignation, effective in late February 1968. His successor, Clifford Clark, quickly aligns with McNamara's view that the war is unwinnable. This results in a leadership crisis in Washington. Amid mounting pressure, Westmoreland requests an additional 206,000 troops for Vietnam, but Johnson refuses. The request is leaked to the media, causing an uproar. With mounting pressure, Johnson changes course. On March 31, 1968, President Johnson announces that he will limit the bombing of North Vietnam, which had been underway since 1965, and open negotiations with the North Vietnamese government. Then, in a dramatic move, he declares, "I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president." In reality, Johnson knows his legacy is in ruins. He has already lost a Democratic Party primary, and the war is costing $2 billion a month, equivalent to around $17 billion today. This financial strain leaves little room for the domestic reforms he cherishes, and he is candid with his advisors. "I don't give a damn about the election. I'll be happy to keep doing what is right and lose the election. I will have overwhelming disapproval in the polls. I will go down the drain." The North announces that it is receptive to talks, but it makes clear that it wishes to negotiate from a position of strength as the victor of the Tet Offensive. But who really won the Tet Offensive on the ground? Despite the US suffering higher casualties and denying the North Vietnamese territorial gains, the battle is often viewed as a US defeat. In reality, the Tet Offensive is a disappointment for Hanoi. It reveals that the cities of South Vietnam are no closer to embracing the revolution, and there are no mass defections from the ARVN, Army of the Republic of Vietnam. The offensive also decimates the Viet Cong, suffering huge losses and exposing many of its secret agents. Some historians even suggest that the Tet Offensive was deliberately designed to reduce the influence of the Southern insurgency and bring it under tighter North Vietnamese control, although there is little solid evidence for this theory. However, the Tet Offensive does succeed in an unintended way by creating political shockwaves in the US and eroding public support. The American public is unprepared for the intensity of the Vietnam War, and Johnson had actively worked to insulate them from the conflict. Although undermining US public opinion was not an explicit objective of the Tet Offensive, North Vietnamese strategists recognized that public will was a vulnerability for the US, a vulnerability they themselves did not share. While the Tet Offensive may be considered a US victory in terms of military engagements, its effect on US public opinion and the credibility of the US administration at home and abroad represents a defeat in the idea battle space. The US media, which had largely supported government statements on Vietnam up to this point, becomes increasingly critical. Veteran news anchor Walter Cronkite speaks for many when he asks, "What the hell is going on? I thought we were winning the war." Meanwhile, North Vietnamese ideologists interpret the Tet Offensive losses within their long-standing revolutionary methodology. The North's political control, propaganda, and cultural conditioning have long prepared the population to accept high casualties. As North Vietnamese leader Le Duan declared, "The North will not count the cost." 1968 becomes the bloodiest year of the war for the US, with nearly 17,000 American fatalities. Through the summer, the North launches more offensives, often referred to as mini-Tet offensives. These too result in high casualties for both sides, with about 400 Americans dying each week in May. By late 1968, 500,000 US troops are in Vietnam. As the number of troops and casualties increases, more Americans have direct or indirect experience with the war, such as when a relative is sent overseas. This growing exposure erodes American public support, which is a significant factor in any war. As Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz wrote, "An effective war effort needs equilibrium between the trinity, the state, the army, and the people." After Tet, North Vietnam's trinity remains strong, bolstered by government regimentation, ideological convictions, and nationalist aspirations. Meanwhile, as the 1968 US election approaches, the US trinity begins to crumble, with growing divisions within the government, the military, and the public.